Do you want to start an argument? If you do, bring up the death penalty in a room full of people. Some will be sure that the death penalty is an awful throwback to ancient times. No educated person would favor it. Others will find it essential to provide justice to society. Only the weak-kneed wouldn't want it. Execution certainly has a colorful history. In ancient times, people killed offenders in the most painful and also most spectacular way they could. The pain was to deter others from the crime. The spectacular part was to draw attention to the fact that revenge had been taken on the offender and to humiliate the offender. The ancient Romans made execution so spectacular they also served as popular entertainment. The most famous means of Roman execution was feeding criminals to lions, tigers, or other wild beasts. The picture shows a lion being released against a group of Christians. Criminals, as they supposed Christians to be, being torn apart and eaten by lions was no doubt a spectacle. If a man was found guilty of some serious offense, his entire family would be killed. There was no greater humiliation than to have failed to protect one's family. He would be forced to see his daughters being raped, his entire family killed, one at a time. In the picture, a boy awaits a lion. The offender might have his limbs very slowly torn off his body, one at a time, until he died. It was far from the worst Roman punishment. The worst execution of all didn't happen in an arena, but in public areas. There a man might be crucified. This is the crucifixion of Jesus. Unlike many pictures of a crucifixion, it correctly shows the use of 4 nails. Incorrectly, it shows a cloth over his private parts. The Romans almost always crucified people naked. It was more humiliating that way. Being torn apart by a lion took a few minutes. The agony of crucifixion might last 3 days. The idea was to humiliate the victim and promote insults from the public. It was supposed to deter people passing by from doing the crime, but I doubt it deterred many others. By the 19th century, most countries had settled on using hanging or beheading as their means of execution. The hanging shown is the hanging of Saddam Hussein. The government of Iraq tried him for crimes and carried out the execution. Hanging is a more brutal death than usually depicted in movies. The criminal has a noose fixed around his neck, then he is dropped as much as 8 feet. His drop is very suddenly stopped by the rope holding the noose. The great force of the sudden stop puts enormous strain on the rope and on his neck. If a big enough rope isn't used, the rope might break, or on the other hand, the man's head might be pulled off. Those things don't happen often, but they do happen. The most famous instrument for beheading is the guillotine. It is much more humane than the usual instruments of beheading, the axe and the sword. All methods of beheading have one serious drawback for the person being killed. The victim doesn't have his head cut off. He has his body cut off. The executed remain conscious for a short time. From the point of view of the victim, he suddenly has no contact with his body below the neck. He might try to speak, but of course he can't. Estimates of how long his severed head remained conscious vary a great deal. I have found estimates from 7 to 25 seconds. Nobody really knows. Starting in the 20th century, governments started looking for more humane means of execution. The electric chair was invented in the U.S. The first execution is shown in the artist's drawing on the screen. It happened in 1890 and was considered a botched execution. In the 20th century, the electric chair was taken as the execution method of many U.S. states. The electric chair was supposed to knock out the victim with the first jolt of electricity. Then a much larger voltage shock was used to kill the man. That's how it worked in theory. In fact, it was very brutal, worse than hanging. The condemned sometimes caught fire while still conscious. By the time the electric chair came into wide use, executions were no longer open to the public. That way, the public didn't know how bad they were. In time, the truth about the electric chair came out. The various states looked for more humane execution methods. The gas chamber had some popularity for a time. Hydrogen cyanide gas was used. Unfortunately, criminals in the gas chamber often struggled to escape their belts holding them in a chair, screamed, or sometimes vomited. This eventually gave the gas chamber a bad name. Then, execution by lethal injection was introduced. At first, this also was promoted as a humane way to kill. The person to be executed is strapped down on a table. An IV or intravenous needle is inserted in a vein. A series of drugs are administered through the IV. The first is usually a sedative, then the lethal drugs. Lethal injection is known for a high number of botched executions. The new execution method being considered now is a gas chamber with nitrogen gas. I don't know what problems there will be with that method, but I'm quite sure there will be some. It's history. Is the death penalty inhumane? The public wants executions to be humane. That's why the public keeps asking for new means of execution. The public wants a humane way of executing criminals. Unhappily, a truly humane execution is impossible. From the time a judge sentences the criminal and raps the gavel until the execution order is given by a court, he won't know when it will happen. It, of course, comes on his mind often. In the U.S., a criminal may wait a decade or more for the execution to be done. That time will be lived in solitary confinement in a small cell, except for maybe an hour or two each day. Once the execution order is given, his execution will be on his mind much of his waking hours. The American Civil Liberties Union calls this a death before dying. When the execution does come, it is little wonder that the man acts with great emotion. He may struggle to escape the belts holding him to a chair or table, or gasp for breath, or vomit. A condemned man will act that way no matter how humane the method of execution is otherwise. As for the morality of execution, it can be argued that the government is doing the very thing that brings most criminals to be executed. It's murder. An ordinary citizen commits murder, so the state orders that they be murdered. Is murder immoral or not? I don't have a really good answer to the sign. However, the argument made on the sign flies in the face of a long tradition to expect that a person injured by another person's actions should see the criminal be made to pay a price of equal value to the loss he suffered. As the Bible puts it, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Those that oppose the death penalty will argue that it doesn't deter people from committing murder. Most murders are carried out in a moment of anger. If it isn't done in anger, the killer convinced himself he will get away with it. I must point out that nobody knows, and nobody ever will know, how many people are deterred from murder by the death penalty. I think the number is small, but not zero. Do we need the death penalty? There is no doubt we could get along without it. The countries of the European Union seem to get along without it. Even assuming that the death penalty is no deterrent at all, the penalty of death still serves one function. That is, that it allows the family of a murder victim, and in a few cases the rest of society, to feel that justice was served. When a murderer gets life in prison, the family of the victim knows that their tax money will give food, clothing, and a bed to the man who killed one of their family. It does not provide justice that all people will accept. It will be argued that I'm suggesting that our laws should provide revenge for the family of a murder victim. One man's revenge is another man's justice. Revenge is not a dirty word. Should we eliminate the death penalty? I think we should, if for no other reason than the fact that the U.S. has a death penalty makes the U.S. look backward in the minds of many people in other countries. Some countries will not extradite a criminal to America unless they are guaranteed the criminal will not be executed. There is, however, a much better reason to abolish executions. In making this video, I had originally thought to leave the issue of whether we should abolish the death penalty up in the air. Leave that issue to the viewer. My own view of the death penalty was more or less undecided, but leaning toward being in favor of it. Then I thought about these two pictures. Yes, the one on the left shows what happened in ancient Rome, but human psychology isn't much different now than it was then. The history of execution is filled with examples of very great cruelty. Executions lend themselves to cruelty. The cruelty did not stop after ancient Rome. It is still with us. The way those condemned to executions are now kept in small solitary confinement cells, sometimes for decades, shows we are applying cruelty to our so-called humane executions. The rest of the advanced nations of the world are moving away from the death penalty. I think the United States should too.